I will be focusing on how customer marketing and content marketing can work together to leverage the voice of your customers and experts to answer 4 key questions that buyers have as they move through their journey from status quo to making a decision as to which solution provider to purchase from. And so what I wanted to do first, before we get into the kind of heart of it, is just kind of share my transformation story with you. So you'll understand how I got here and where my ideas come from. Now, I've been working in B2B technology marketing specifically for over 25 years, and I've always focused on content strategy and content development, both as a manager, a consultant, and a roll up your sleeves writer. I mean, you name it, I've produced it. And I would say it was about, 7 years ago or so, I was helping a client to revamp their website content. And we were really struggling with how to convey the value proposition and their differentiators on the homepage. Because of course, we all have limited space on that homepage. We know that the average, website visit is only about, for the homepage is only about 30 seconds. So of course we couldn't say everything we wanted to say. We had to prioritize. And, like so many other marketing teams, what we did is we decided to get the input from other people, right? So we invited, a number of people to the table. We invited the company's co-founder, the head of sales, the head of R&D or product development. And we basically went around the table and asked for their input. And of course, the head of product development wanted naturally to highlight, the technical capabilities that differentiated the product. And then, of course, the sales wanted to include the points that they were using in the last few deals with prospects to win the deals. And then, of course, the co-founder of the company wanted to sell the vision of where the company and products were going. So really big picture stuff. Now, this, of course, only made our jobs even more difficult, right? Not easier, because everyone had great ideas. They had compelling reasons to make the recommendations that they were making in terms of what they thought we should focus on the homepage. And, so we were left with figuring out, how do we make this all work on the homepage? How do we, we wanted to please everyone. We didn't want to leave anybody's input, on the cutting room floor, but it just made it so much more difficult. And I remember, thinking to myself, while I respect everyone's opinion, these are all smart people, around the table, it just felt like we were making stuff up in a way. I mean, in the end, I said, what is it that buyers want? What customers want? Shouldn't that be the starting point for all content creation? And so after I completed the project, I then, did some research, into how it could use personas with content development as a whole, not just for websites. And, back then, this was like 2013. I had heard about, personas, but I wasn't entirely sure how to create them or use this. So I did a little bit of research. I came across a company called Buyer Persona Institute. And they had developed their own unique methodology for interviewing B2B buyers to uncover, 5 key insights about their journey. And that basically was, what triggered their investment, what improvements were they looking to make by making this investment and implementing a solution, what criteria they were using to decide who to buy from. And there's my dogs barking in the background, my apologies. And what steps, they took during their buyer journey and who was involved. And I was just so impressed by what I learned that I decided to take their training and become a researcher at Buyer Persona Institute. I'm hoping they're going to stop that. They don't usually bark, so this is very unusual. Can you hear them very loudly? Let me just see if I can close that door a little bit. My apologies.
This is the new normal that we all live in, right? In the virtual world.
Sorry about that. That's really bad timing. They just never bark. They're such good little dogs. So what I was saying is, I decided to take the training and eventually became a researcher at Buyer Persona Institute. And I would say that, that really, really changed completely how I approach things. I mean, since 2013, I've interviewed nearly 1,000 senior IT and business executives about how they made their complex B2B buying decisions. And what they shared with me just completely transformed the way I think about marketing and how to produce content. And the most significant change, I would say, in my approach is that I frame everything as a buyer question. I really get into the mindset of buyers and dig deep into their thought processes and the questions they have as they move through their buying journey. And while every buying journey certainly is different, because of course the problems and solutions are different, in each journey, The logical thought process and the types of questions buyer asks are alike. There's a lot of similarities, and also after interviewing nearly 1,000 buyers, I've seen that there are many expectations and many requirements that are the same regardless of the type of solution. So, when I develop a content strategy or produce content, I start by saying, what buyer questions are we trying to answer? And when you do that, it really changes the focus of your content. The focus is no longer about what you as a vendor or a service provider want to say to buyers, but what buyers really want to know and understand. And so when you do that, you then begin to see gaps in the content that vendors typically produce in their strategies. It becomes really evident that most content, or a lot of content, doesn't fully address buyers' questions and information needs. And I know this because I hear it from buyers all the time. What I like to do every time I finish a research study for a company is I like to go to their website to compare what information they have on their website against what I've heard in the interviews. And I can tell you the vast majority of the websites, I don't see the things that I've heard in those interviews. I don't see that they've included all the things that influence their or that address their expectations. Now, maybe the information is somewhere on their websites and I just couldn't find it. But look, if I can't find the information, neither can buyers. And we know that people will only spend about 30 seconds on a home page and 1 minute on a product page before they leave. So it's just really important that that message is up front and center. And here's just a few things of what I've heard buyers saying in their own words. Like, these are actual verbatim quotes, and this is around websites. They're saying things like, the information is too high level, lots of words, no information. And so they want more details about the product, as well as what it will take to implement it, how much time and effort, right? And by not including the things buyers are looking for on the website, it's causing vendors to be eliminated from consideration. Here's a buyer who said that he visited the vendor website before even inviting the companies to participate in an RFP. And if they didn't see the core capability listed on their website, they knock them from the running, because that's the reality, right? Buyers typically start with a long list of vendors at the beginning of their search, 10, 15, 20 names, whatever. And then they go to their website and their goal is to quickly weed them out so they can get to a short list of just a few manageable companies to evaluate. So that's the reality, right? And they're saying the same thing about, case studies. They're saying even case studies lack details. They don't provide enough context to help them understand whether they can also achieve the same results. Here, this buyer is talking about how case studies not only lack the details for her company needs to assess whether that the solution would work in their environment, but also that they found the case studies that were too much about large enterprises, right? And that wasn't helpful because, this company was a mid-market company and they needed to know how they could be successful, with a small team. And if you thought buyers or people don't like to read, well, that's just not the case. They have a lot at stake and they need to make an educated decision about their investment. And so they need as much details as possible. But here's the catch. They want to start with a quick read, a one-page synopsis. And then if they find the information helpful, then they want a detailed 10, 20-page document that provides a lot of the comprehensive information. So here they say, details as much as possible is how this buyer ended his thought. And even white papers, surprisingly, don't have the details that buyers are looking for. So buyers want best practices. They want technical information, right? This buyer talks about not just wanting information that paints a rosy picture. They want to know what KPIs to use, how to maximize that investment, and all the things to be aware of. She wants a realistic assessment of the different things to implement, the solution, and what could possibly go wrong. And here is a fascinating quote that I love from a buyer who doesn't actually read white papers from vendors to learn something new. He reads them to validate the vendor's knowledge, saying that if a vendor doesn't mention requirements that their company has already identified as critical, then that vendor just doesn't have enough implementation experience. And so they're not aware of the things that are needed to be successful. right? But there is good news, right? Buyers need and they do want your content. And this is a great book if you haven't read this or haven't come across it. This is from CEB, the research firm that's behind that famous stat that everyone now uses around how 60% of the buying decision is made before buyers contact a vendor. Well, in their book, The Challenger Customer, they say that companies struggle the most getting stakeholders to agree on the business needs and the solution requirements, right? And that evaluating vendors is actually the easy part. So if vendors can get their foot in the door early, and speak to companies before they begin their actual evaluation and help them through those two critical stages, they can really, really influence, the criteria that they use to evaluate and select a partner, right? Also, in a research study from Aberdeen from last year, the study confirmed that companies, do want help in these areas. They will contact vendors early in their journey as they're researching and defining their needs, but only if they can tell them something that they don't already know about a solution category, or if they can provide objective information that helps them to frame that decision. So I see this as an exciting opportunity for both customer marketers and content marketers to team up and produce that valuable content that buyers want and need. And you have, in doing so, you really have an opportunity to differentiate yourself from your competitors. You can be filling that void with truly helpful content. And when you think about it, you really do have the keys to the kingdom. I mean, your customers are your greatest source of insights. And because of that, you no longer have to make stuff up. You can interview them. You can find out, exactly what their questions and information needs are. And as they're going through that journey, and then you can use those insights that you captured during the interviews to feed your content engine and produce more valuable content. And, I bet if you ask your customers to share their experience and advice instead of asking them for a quote or an endorsement or to, get a case study out of them, they will be more likely to go on the record and agree, to share that, with the public. And last, if you interview your customers, think about it. If you interview your customers on an ongoing basis, you're effectively building a buyer persona knowledge base that you can pull from, as the need arises. And also, you'll be tracking changes to their buying experience. And so, this will then help you to produce fresh new content on a regular basis because you'll have a pulse always on their thinking and their information needs. So great opportunity to, tap into your customer base, leverage their thoughts. So next, I'd like to also just, have a quick look at that B2B buying journey, and then we'll flip to the actual questions, those 4 questions that I was talking about. Now, I know that so much has already been written about the buyer journey, and analyst firms use different terms to describe the different stages. And I'm going to describe what happens at each stage based on what I've learned, interviewing those, close to 1,000 buyers. And there's a lot of similarities naturally, with what the analyst firms are saying. So there are essentially, 4 key stages of the journey, right? The stage where buyers are living with a problem and not doing anything about it, often referred to as the status quo. Next is the problem exploration stage, where buyers are acknowledging they have a problem and investigating what they can do about it. Next is the solution identification phase, where they're basically defining their goals and needs and identifying, what their requirements will be around a solution and vendor. And last, they're actually evaluating. It's a vendor selection stage where they're evaluating and comparing and trying to decide, which to buy from. So in the status quo stage, there are 2 scenarios for why buyers aren't doing anything about a problem. Either buyers are not aware that they have a problem, or that a different type of solution exists that can help them solve the problem. Or, buyers are aware of both the problem and solution, but they're choosing to live with it because either it's not painful enough to make it a priority now, or they're focusing on other bigger problems and priorities. They know they'll eventually have to solve that problem at some point in time, but right now it's just not a priority for them. In the problem exploration stage, again, there are two scenarios that I've seen. Buyers are either actively or passively investigating how to solve a problem. In the active scenario, they've made it a priority to solve that problem. They've committed to making an investment and buying a solution. But in the passive scenario, they haven't made that commitment yet. They're just keeping themselves informed about the problem, what their peers are doing, and what solution providers are out there in the market. They're just keeping a pulse on what's going on so that the day it does become a priority for their company, they aren't starting from scratch, right? They've already done some preliminary research. And then in the solution identification stage, buyers are now really rolling up their sleeves and saying, okay, how do we solve this problem for our organization? In the previous phase, they were exploring how to solve that problem more generally. But now they need to dive into the specifics for their organization. So this stage basically has two steps, which sometimes are done separately, sometimes they're done at the same time, depending on the company. But they have to first identify their business goals, KPIs, and the actual needs of the people who will be using the solution or will be affected by the solution. And then they need to identify the capabilities and the features of the solution that they'll be evaluating to support those goals. So this then essentially becomes the criteria, right, that they use to evaluate, compare vendors, and ultimately decide who to buy from. And finally, in the vendor selection phase, buyers are actively evaluating and engaging with vendors in order to compare and decide who to buy from. And part of that evaluation process is done without or before speaking to the vendor, what I like to call the indirect engagement or evaluation. And part of that evaluation process is done by speaking or engaging directly with sales. And when they're indirectly evaluating, what they're doing essentially is they're speaking to their peers, they're consulting with analyst firms, they're going online, reading articles and customer reviews. They're going to conferences and events to learn which vendors are out there and having informal discussions with vendors. And of course, they're visiting the vendors' websites. And when they finally do, directly engage with vendors, they're issuing the RFIs and RFPs, having telephone conversations, in-person meetings when that did take place. They're, watching product demos, live demos. They're doing a free trial or proof of concept, and then, asking for customer references in order to, see what their experience was like. So, those are the typical stages of the journey. Now, if we kind of look at those four key questions, as I mentioned, earlier, I like to frame everything as a buyer question because it puts me in their shoes. It forces me to look at things from their perspective. It forces me to answer their questions as if they were in front of me and we were having a natural conversation. And so that's how I like to approach things. So the first question really is, should we solve this problem now? And so your goal as a solution provider is to persuade buyers to move away from status quo, to convince them that they should make it a priority now. And if the buyer is not aware that they have a problem, then obviously you need to first create awareness around that problem. Equally important, it's not just creating awareness, you need to quantify that problem. You need to explain, how serious and widespread and prevalent is the problem, and what does that cost? What's the cost and risk of inaction? Right? What will they lose or fail to achieve if they don't do this? And research has proven that people are more motivated by what they'll lose than what they'll gain. So it's not just enough to quantify the benefits and the return on investment. You need to quantify the losses and the downstream problems that this creates, right? However, if buyers are aware of the problem, this is a lot tougher to answer because they've chosen to do nothing at this point in time. And so the key thing here is to link that problem, the problem that your solution addresses, that immediate problem, to an even bigger problem or technology investment that buyers are actively pursuing. So you need to poke a hole in their strategy. You need to explain how they won't achieve, or they will only partially achieve their objective if they don't also solve the problem that your solution is addressing as part of their bigger strategy. So you need to acknowledge their current priorities and say what they risk if they don't include your solution category as part of that overall strategy and investment. So that's your first goal in answering that buyer question. Now, the second question to answer in your content strategy is, what's the best way to solve this problem? And here your goal as a vendor is to persuade them to invest in your solution category. Notice how I didn't say your solution, your company's solution. I'm saying your solution category. Now, solution category is the group of solutions that your products or services fall into. For example, enterprise resource planning or marketing automation or customer marketing, right? That's the category of solutions to which you belong. And in this stage, buyers are open to considering all the possible ways to solving a problem, right? Including a completely different approach to solving that problem, or building the solution themselves in-house, or stitching together different best-of-breed solutions to address all the use cases that, let's say, your product may address. So think of this as your indirect competitors. So you need to persuade them that your solution category is the most effective way, the easiest way, the least costly way, the least risky way, etc., to solve that problem. And then the third buyer question to answer is, what should we look for in a solution and provider? Now, your goal here is to help buyers identify the requirements they should look for, both in a solution and provider as well, in order to ensure a successful outcome. So you need to align your features, your functionality, capabilities, differentiators, whatever, with their business goals and user needs. You need to explain how those requirements help them to achieve their goals, how they help users to perform specific tasks or achieve specific goals. Because if buyers don't understand how your capabilities map back to their goals and needs, they might not understand why they're critical. They might say, well, this is a nice to have, but not a must have. So ideally, you also have a number of capabilities that are unique to your solution and differentiate you. So, and also, differentiators that would have, your competitors have a difficult time saying that they could support. So essentially what you want is to influence the criteria, right, the buyers are using to evaluate. So your company has the most boxes ticked off on the buyer's checklist at the end. And then the final question to answer, is why should we buy from you rather than your competitor? Now, I realize that at first glance, it may seem like, you've done a good job. If you've done a good job influencing the criteria, then, by default, buyers should conclude that your company offers the best solution. But unfortunately, that's not always the case for several reasons, right? First, maybe your competitors have more differentiators than you, or maybe you have more differentiators, but your competitors can claim they can support that in a different way. So you really need to be explicit to explain why you're better, why your way is better than your competitors, and what they risk if they choose your competitor, right? Or maybe there aren't enough differentiators between any provider because the market's highly saturated. And the number of times I hear buyers saying, all the vendors are more or less the same, you can interchange their names. It's crazy. I hear that a lot often. So you still need to succinctly explain why you versus a competitor, and so that they can also succinctly answer that question to a senior stakeholder when it's time for them to justify the decision to buy from you instead of a competitor. So you need to kind of recap that, right? I also want to take a few minutes to talk about, some of the common requirements across all solution categories, because I think it's one of the most overlooked opportunities for helping buyers and convincing them to go with you instead of a competitor. As technology marketers, we typically focus on the features, the functionality, and the capabilities that are specific and unique to our solution categories. For example, if you're an electronic signature provider, you'll talk about how you authenticate users, the different methods for signing a document electronically, what you do to secure the document after someone has signed, etc. However, so those are like what I like to refer to as the core capabilities of a solution. It's unique to that solution category, but it's not the only things that factor into buyers' decisions, right? There's also a pretty long list of requirements that are common to all buying decisions. And after interviewing nearly 1,000 senior stakeholders, I can tell you just how important these things are, especially when buyers perceive no real difference between vendors, and that happens a lot. I mean, here are some of the things I hear frequently, too frequently. They were all very similar, surprisingly similar. You could almost interchange their names. So you then have to start looking at other things, right? Some of that was based on gut feeling, which is excuse me, then you look at things like their reputation, who else has used them, their after sales support, and things like that. And so I do hear a lot of that, right? In fact, I would probably say, over 50% of the research studies that I've done, I've heard buyers say they're virtually all the same. So ouch, right? That's not good news. And so that's why it's so important that you don't just create content around your core capabilities. You also need to talk about capabilities that are common to all buying decisions, right? And they fall into two buckets: common solution capabilities and then the common vendor attributes. And so your common solution capabilities would include things like ease of use, right? Total cost of ownership, implementation and product support, deployment options, third-party integration, security, and what I like to call the ilities, right? The reliability, the configurability, upgradability, scalability, extensibility. Um, and if we look at the common vendor attributes, they'll include things like industry accolades and recognitions, your knowledge and experience, customers, stability, value-added partnership. And I know these are all things your company likely addresses somewhere, on your website or in a data sheet or in your sales presentations. But I think you have a real opportunity to create content, like to include that in your content marketing strategy and create long form, content for each of these topics, or by grouping complementary topics together. And I don't see a lot of that in the vendor marketing that I've come across, but it is a real, opportunity. And I think that's really important because, like, I can tell you right now, when buyers have the perception that there are no real differences among providers, that their core capabilities are the same, then the deciding factors that I hear over and over again in interviews are things like customers, right? What experience do you have solving this problem for other companies in our industry? Peer recommendations, whose names come up most often when they ask their peers, who they recommend or they've used or they should buy. Ease of use, how long will it take for people to learn how to use your solution? And will it actually make their jobs easier than before? Support, if something goes wrong, and inevitably it will, how responsive will you be? And how quickly will you resolve those issues? But also, how reactive versus proactive will you be? Will you monitor and identify issues before they even become a problem? They want to know those types of things. Relationship, how easy will it be for them to do business with you? Who do they trust and think their people will get along with and work well? Who gives them, I love this, the warm and fuzzies? Believe it or not, I've heard this multiple times during interviews, the vendor that gave us the warm and fuzzies. And cost, of course, last but not least, cost always is a factor, especially if you can't convince them that, there's any differences among vendors, right? So they're looking for things like value for money, predictable and transparent pricing, and of course, total cost of ownership. So there you have it, 4 key buyer questions that can really fuel your content engine. Should we solve this problem now? What's the best way to solve this problem? What should we look for in a solution, and why buy from you versus a competitor? So now that we understand what questions and requirements are important to buyers, what do you do next? Now, obviously, this makes for a potentially really long list of possible topics to address in your content. And in an ideal world, yes, you would work your way through each topic in order, in the order of the buyer journey. But, like most marketing teams, you likely have limited time, limited resources. So you'll need to prioritize. And, here's just some ideas for how you do that, right? Just start by making a list of the 4 key buyer questions. Make a list of all the core solution capabilities, the common vendor requirements and vendor attributes that apply to your product. And this essentially, when you make that list, it's a list of all possible topics that you could potentially include in your content strategy. Next, you'll want to rank each topic, according to, you want to rank it by saying, does this present an opportunity or an advantage? Like if we create content around this, is this actually an opportunity or advantage to us? Or no, maybe there's no opportunity or advantage, or it's neutral, doesn't give us any benefit, or, whatever. And then you kind of look at that and say, okay, does the topic, does it address a need? Like which topics address the greatest need for your buyers or your company? Which are the most important to your customers and buyers? Or where are you as a company struggling the most, right? You also want to rank it according to your differentiator. Which topics enable you to showcase your differentiators and spotlight your strengths. Commonly misunderstood. Which topics are the most commonly misunderstood buyers that if you could correct that, misconception, they would, look at your solution in a more favorable light. Um, which topics have the greatest objections from buyers that if you address would then help them to see the value provide. Then of course there's, which topics can you share the greatest insights and thought leadership around? And next, your customers, which enable you to showcase your customers. Which customers can you name drop? Which do you have solid proof points around, et cetera. And then, of course, any other criteria that you think is important for, establishing whether that topic is worth pursuing. So that's the first thing, is just, going through that list one by one and then tallying up to see which topics, score the highest, put them in order of priority based on their scores, and voila, you've got a prioritized list of topics. Okay, and so then after you've, identified and prioritized those topics, the next step is to identify how you can use, as we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, how do you use the different voices in your content strategy? And when I'm talking about voice, it's the voice of your experts. It's your own company voice and the voice of your customers. How do you use those voices to address each topic and answer buyer questions in a way that builds credibility and trust? Now, the bulk of content that most marketers create typically uses what I call that company voice, right? This is the neutral voice that isn't attributed to anyone in particular in your company. It's it's the voice that makes claims about your company. It's the voice that you use on your website, in your white paper, in your data sheets, right? But if you want buyers to believe you and adopt your point of view, you want to be able to say, well, don't just take our word for it. Here's what our customers and subject matter experts are saying. And, these subject matter experts can be people working at an analyst firm, a consulting firm, trade publication, or, it can be just an independent thought leader of some sort, who's out there blogging about, the same or similar topics. But, a subject matter expert can also be somebody from within your organization, like your CEO or president, or the head of R&D, or a product or industry evangelist, right? And what you essentially want from these experts is you want them to provide that objective 30,000-foot view of the topic that's backed by research, or the cold hard facts, or sound reasoning, or firsthand testimonials, right? Someone who can share the big picture and speak to the trends that they're seeing across different use cases or geographies or industry segments. Whereas your customers, on the other hand, here you have a real opportunity to get them to provide that subjective view on the ground, of what it's really like to experience this problem and work through this issue, what it really looks like and feels like to go through this experience, the blood, sweat, and tears and everything that went into successfully solving the problem using your solution. And I would say when all three voices are aligned, when they're saying the same thing, but from a slightly different perspective, you can then really build credibility and trust. You have a better shot at persuading buyers then to adopt your point of view, because it's not just that company voice that's saying things, everyone is saying these things. So that's how I recommend that you use those voices. And you can bring in all three voices into the same piece of content that you're producing, in the form of quotes, but you could also create separate content, right, dedicated to each of these voices, so that you really provide a comprehensive view or a comprehensive opinion piece from that person. It's really up to you, right? Use the most effective and persuasive voices in any combination you think is best to address that topic. Okay, and then so after you've identified the possible voices that you can use and the specific individuals you can use, the next step is then to identify, the most effective content formats to, package up your answers to buyer questions and to address those topics. And there's just so many to choose from, right? When you consider, short form, long form, website content, events, interviews, videos, sales tools, enablement tools. I mean, I've listed here, 35 formats, but I'm sure you have other ideas and formats that you're using, right? There's just so many possibilities. And finally, the other thing you may want to consider is creating different message tiers for your content, depending on where buyers are in their journey. And the way I look at that is like tier one, it's simply, hooking them with your content, getting their attention. You're essentially, I mean, what you're essentially doing is you're interrupting them, right, with your content. So it has to be very, very short. You have to quickly be able to say, hey, I have something that deserves your undivided attention, right? And then in tier two, you've gotten their attention, and now you need to persuade them to adopt your point of view. So this content is going to be longer and more comprehensive. And then the third message tier, hopefully by the time, you get to that third message tier, you've convinced them, you've persuaded them in that longer form content that they should be considering that topic in a certain way. Now what you want to do is to empower them to sell your point of view, to other stakeholders in their company, right? So you want them essentially to become champions, right, for your point of view, for your product. So you want to have some sort of self-serve tools that enables them to do that. So those are the three message tiers. And so now when you look at, 4 buyer questions, 3 aligned voices, over 35 content formats, and 3 message tiers, you essentially have over 1,260 possible combinations to choose from, right? Now, and you just have to build an army of content creators to execute this. So, just kidding. Of course, no company will ever be able to, produce content, this amount of content. But the point is that there is just no shortage of ideas, right, for producing that content. When I hear companies saying, well, what should we write about? I just like, I could just throw so many different combinations at you. It's crazy, right? When you think about your content in this way with the buyer questions, aligning different voices, message tiers, there's just so many possibilities. And so then it's just a question of putting it all together, right? And it's going through the exercise of identifying those possible combinations. So again, just make a list of each buyer question and topic, and then identify which voice, which content format and message tier you'll use to produce each topic. So, it's just going through that exercise, saying what makes sense for each of those, questions, topics, voices, and message tiers. Right? And so that is essentially, those are my ideas for creating a content strategy. It's something that's been kind of helping certain clients with. It's fascinating, in my view, to be thinking in this way, framing things as questions. And I hope that you get something useful out of this, that you find this valuable. And if you do, come to my website, sign up for email updates. I'll be sharing free buyer insights, and eventually I will be introducing in 2020 training and coaching services around how to answer those 4 buyer questions. So my website is buyerjourneydesign.com, and you can sign up and you can learn more about how buyers go through their journey. And now what I'll do is I'll just stop to take some questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Gordana. That was great. A great overview of what that buying journey is really like, because a lot of times as customer marketers, we're not as close to that as maybe our demand marketers or our salespeople are. But by being more aware of that, I think we can all be so much better versed in really understanding how our customer voice could be infused there. And so I think one of the things that I know people are asking about, and always have questions about here, is what would you suggest for how customer marketers and content marketers, how can they be better collaborating and working together and figuring out how to jointly infuse the customer and expert voice into the content marketing agenda? Because a lot of times there's so much that they want to write about, right? There's so much content they want to create. And there's always the urge to have it be the content that's invented internally, that's all about us as opposed to all about them. What have you seen in terms of getting the content marketers much more comfortable and not feeling threatened that they're going to lose their job if we start using customer and expert voice?
Oh, holy smokes. No, I mean, the way I see it is, seriously, before I was doing the buyer interviews, and before, having even these positions of customer marketing, I know I was intimidated by even tackling this, because yes, you can go to certain subject matter experts to have certain parts of, the information. When you're doing your research to find out how you're going to tackle a topic, right? You are going to go to different, subject matter experts, but they're always going to give you that limited view based on their job responsibility. And in the end, if you go to your customers, that's your research. You have all the insights that you need. So what I would say is, the two teams should be coming up with their content strategies together, because, one is going to feed the other. And to not look at them as, separate initiatives, or one is going to take over the other. You need both, right? But if anything, having access to your customers, interviewing them regularly, it removes the making stuff up aspect of the job, and it only strengthens, your content.
And similarly, we have a question here about having limited resources to produce content. How do you recommend that we get started? And I've experienced this a lot of times. There might be
Yeah.
somebody that's engineering what content we want to create, but then they're either looking for outsourced professional writers, or trying to compete for time with internal experts to create that content. So what do you do when you have, where do you start if you've got limited resources?
Yeah, I mean, with my framework, I would say, figure out which buyer question is the most pressing to answer, right? Like, where are you struggling most as a company, right? Is it trying to persuade people to move off the status quo? Is it trying to convince them that, a certain, capability is urgent, is critical? Is it, convincing them that they should buy from you? Like, you really need to understand where you're having problems as a company, right? And so, yes, you can look at your pipeline to see where there isn't enough things moving forward, but another great way to do that is just speak to sales. And I did that recently with a client. I spoke to all levels of sales to find out, like, what are you hearing? What are the typical questions that you're getting? What are the typical objections you're getting from buyers? And where is that stalling in the sales process? And that was a great source of, and then when you do that from all levels, from, as soon as marketing hands over a lead to sales, and when you think about how it gets funneled through different levels of sales, when you speak to each one of those, you're going to get really great insights as to, where's the biggest problems. And then you can be proactive as a marketing team to go out and create content. So, you create that self-serve content that buyers will find, as they're researching, but then you're also creating that same content can then be used by sales to verbally convey, the message to address those questions and concerns and objections that buyers have.
Right. Yes, so here's a great question that just came in from Jill, seconded by Angelique. And so when you're thinking about content specifically for customers who have already purchased, so post-sale and looking to create more advocates, what are some examples of content that can help bring a customer closer to your solution or brand? And I know you and I have talked about this quite a bit. I'll let you, want to hear what you have to say, but then I might, share a point of view on this as well. So content aimed at existing customers at that point in the journey to bring them closer to your solution and your brand.
Yeah, that's a good question. To be really upfront and honest, I haven't done a lot of that, but I know when, in my thinking process about that, it's by continuously, reaching out to them, asking them those questions, getting a pulse for where they are at, where their struggles are. You have the opportunity to then, like, even customers will have struggles, right? With your solution, they may have new problems that crop up. So in continuously engaging with them and, finding out where they're struggling, you can then produce content that addresses that, right? And then,
Yep.
within your own customer community, start sharing that content, or bringing people together, to speak directly with one another, to share their problems and solutions, things that they've tried out.
Right. And just to add to that, I mean, I think I'll give you some ideas of things that I've been doing, with my clients. Is one of the things that, that fits into our theme from yesterday around driving retention. Retention depends on onboarding successfully, and then adoption and usage, and advanced usage, using some of the more advanced features if we're talking a software or a technology platform, like a lot of us. And I know a lot of people, a lot of customer marketers are running programs to try to drive deeper engagement. And I know Evan Jacobs, who was on our last session, he told me about a program that he did at one of his prior companies called Feature Friday, and where they would capture the voice of customers once a week or so, talking about how they use a particular feature. So either internal experts or customers, but what's really powerful these days, and customers love this type of engagement across all the customer engagement programs I work with, the thing that the customers love the most is when they can hear what the best practices, advice, advanced use case scenarios that other customers have come up with. So it's a great opportunity for us as customer marketers to capture that voice of those more advanced customers that have made great strides, package it up, and then share it with those
Mhm.
newer customers or customers that aren't as far along, or maybe some that are dragging their feet or just aren't making a sophisticated usage of where you really want them to be, like your ideal customer profile customers are.
Yeah.
And so that really helps people use more.
Yeah, a lot of opportunities there. Yeah.
So here's one, Travis. There's huge pressure from sales to focus on demand gen with marketing versus supporting the buyer's journey. What advice do you have to help with the paradigm shift to move the org from thinking about the long play versus the short play? I take that to mean that Travis is talking about like demand gen, like content immediately for the campaign of the month that's going out right now, versus trying to map to what you're showing is what buyers really want. Because what you're saying is so not only theoretically, but conceptually and common sense, it just sounds so logical that that's what you want to do, is give buyers what they need as they move through that journey. But our demand gen campaigns aren't always designed that way. Sometimes they're being driven by, we have this product announcement, we have this award
Yeah.
we want to announce, we have
Yeah.
our 30-year anniversary we have to announce. So
Yeah.
so how do you find that balance?
Yeah, I mean, look, the hard, truth is you need both, right? That
Yep.
you can't, you will have to always continue with those announcements. There's a time and place for that. There's a lot of value in those announcements, right? And so I wouldn't recommend to not do them. I'm not saying they're not important, but I think, we certainly, you need to start thinking, a lead comes in, you want to bring that lead through that journey as quickly as possible. You want to move them through it. It's not enough just to have all these come in and then they just stop there. You need to move them forward. And the only way you're going to do that is by supporting, the entire decision-making process, the thought process that they go through. Um,
Right. And when I think of
so
that, what you say, when I think of moving people through that funnel or through that buying process, I think about lead nurturing, right? That's kind
Mhm.
of put it into demand marketers' terms. That's why they're creating lead nurturing
Yeah.
campaigns to try to, you know, drip to them to try to move them along. And what I tell people is, start infusing more customer voice content into those drip campaigns, because it's all about you today probably, and all about your products and features. Well, what if you started capturing some customer stories? And I'm not talking about classic PDF case studies, but more, the more innovative, maybe the video snippets of customers really talking about what life is like as a customer, or what they've been able to do, how their life is different. And then of course the demand marketers measure everything, so they'll be able to see whether they're getting any uplift on those types of touches that
Mm.
are more customer content focused. Because again, my experience is that always happens, that tends to be the most engaging content,
Yeah.
because buyers today, as we know, it's all about trust, and they only put so much trust in what the vendor has to say, but they put an incredible amount of trust in what your current customers have to say.
Yeah. But I would also like to add that to me, and I'm working through this with a client of mine, it's when you answer those core buyer questions and you create just the message foundation on how you're going to answer those questions, that content is the same. The message is the same for both sales and for lead nurturing. You're just
Right.
packaging it up differently. So you
Right.
are accomplishing both because, by answering those questions, you will be able to, move them through their journey.
Right. Yep.
Because
And
one is
just
just self-serve and the other is sales assisted, right?
right. Oh, exactly. Right. And maybe the packaging is different, and the way it gets consumed and when it gets consumed is different, but you're absolutely right. The core ideas behind that, those core reusable assets can be used in both situations.
And they should be. Imagine if sales is not saying the same thing as what marketing is saying in its
Right.
message. I mean,
Well, how
because
often
you
does
just
that
never know when the
happen?
handoff is going to be, right? You never
Right,
know. The handoff is not always that straightforward, right? And it could go back and forth a few times, right?
right. If you get
Yeah.
anybody who's 100% confident that sales is saying exactly and reinforcing exactly what marketing says, type me in the chat. And I'd be surprised if anybody is 100%
Yeah.
confident or even 50% confident. But here's another great point here from Angelique about how is this approach adjusted when the objective is strengthening executive engagement, content strategy focused on this area. And this came up yesterday because we introduced the topic of executive engagement, meaning engaging with the more senior executives at our customer sites and in our markets, right? To strengthen that relationship. And so we do have a session coming up on Thursday, I believe, with Rob Levitt from ITSMA, who's going to be talking specifically about executive engagement. But let me just share one thought on this, and I'd love to hear what you had to say, Gordana. But with executive engagement, one of the best ways to engage them is through more of a thought leadership approach, right? Because, and I'm not saying just throw thought leadership content assets at them. I'm saying let the executives engage in the core ideas behind your own thought leadership platform. And so let's say you're trying to redefine the world of HR, and because I've heard a company talk about this to be all about the workplace of the future, or employment, what employment like is in the future post COVID or with the new normal or something like that. Find executives in your customer sites who have strong points of view about where the future of HR, the future of work, the future of employee engagement is going, and let them pile on their ideas related to some of those key ideas, and they'll end up reinforcing and amplifying a lot of the ideas that you're trying to put into the marketplace as a company around your own thought leadership ideas and platform.
Oh,
So,
very interesting. I mean, I haven't really thought about it in that way because, I mean, to be honest, what I'm always framing it in terms of it's a specific problem and let's be consistent in how we move through that. And I do
yep,
believe it's very important that, you are able to empower a champion within that company with the message and tools that they need to be able to then persuade those senior stakeholders, right?
right. But even in your buyer journey, it might be that the executive might be the budget owner, right? Who tends to be involved at the very beginning, kind of framing the project, framing the big needs, sending other people to go off and investigate
Yeah,
ways of what are approaches for solving this problem and things like that. And then they may stay plugged in, but they may not be out there shopping the whole time.
for sure,
But
for sure.
but they are the ones who are so interested in the approach to solving the problem. I mean, do we hire more staff? Do we bring in a consultant? Do we buy technology? Do we do it ourselves? What are the different approaches that other companies have used to solve this? And that's when they're very receptive to the big ideas that we put out into the market that we call thought leadership, but that they can latch onto to hear about new approaches that maybe challenge their thinking on, or how their current thinking on how to solve that problem. And so that's
Yeah.
what I define as thought leadership. Really, it's content that's your big ideas about how to solve a problem that basically challenges the current thinking, the conventional thinking in the market, and introduces people to a new perspective or a new approach to solving a problem. But that perfectly aligns, I think, with what the earlier stage content that you were talking about. Or when you say about how to solve a problem, what's the best approach, and when people haven't even made that decision yet.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, and you have to just, again, put yourself in their shoes. They're going to look at it from so many different angles, right? And so you have to go through all of those, possibilities and say why that isn't the best approach. This is, our yeah. So you do definitely, if you want to call that thought leadership, absolutely. You're sharing your thought leadership in the sense that you're doing the assessment for them. You're exploring those possibilities and you're already getting the pros and cons of the different approaches, right?
I just want to thank Gordiana so much for this sharing. I'm hoping that the customer marketers were able to expand their knowledge and visibility into what goes on in the buyer journey, and can bring some of these ideas to the content marketers, while also figuring out how they themselves can start to do even more to contribute to the content pipeline, but also the methodology and the thinking that goes into mapping it to that buying journey.